and welcome back to the ILTV News Podcast. I'm your host, Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor at ILTV, and I have the privilege of greeting today Jonathan Pollard, a former Israeli agent, a loving husband, and certainly somebody I can call a good friend, someone who made Aliyah in 2020 and is now officially an Israeli taxpayer. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Maayan. Pleasure to be here.
Sure, I'm so glad you're here. Now, you've been very outspoken, though, recently in terms of what's going on in the news, specifically around the ceasefire with Lebanon. You have said something that I believe was like this: every Likud minister should go to Bibi and tell him either destroy Hezbollah or retire. So can you talk about your reaction to the deal? Why are you so strongly against a ceasefire, which seems to be getting closer and closer?
Dr. Einat Wilf, who I deeply respect, just published an interesting piece called How Wars Should End. And she stated the obvious. They should end with victory and defeat. Hopefully victory for our side and defeat for our enemy. Over the years, we seem to have become accustomed to the concept of managing an enemy, otherwise known as mowing the grass, for example, and nothing is accomplished by this. Right now, we're in an existential war on at least 8 fronts, maybe more, counting the media, maybe more. And we have to get back to this notion of decisiveness in warfare. Why? Because our children, our husbands, our wives are on the front lines, not just on the battlefield, but in our cities as well now. And because of that, our doctrine, our war doctrine, has to reflect that fact. We cannot waste, to be utilitarian about this, we can't waste anybody. If we have them put on a uniform or live in a dangerous area, we have to fight for a decisive end to the conflict. We can't bequeath the conflict to our children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. A ceasefire, as far as I'm concerned, allows Hezbollah to walk away with a win. Why? They win by surviving. That's all they have to do to claim a win. And in this neck of the woods, perception is 99% of reality. So unless they are seen to be defeated, whether they acknowledge it or not is immaterial, but it's whether they are seen by our regional neighbors to be defeated is of paramount importance to us.
But, the majority of the Israeli public seems to want some kind of ceasefire, especially when we talk now going to the other side of the country, to the south, to Gaza. The push is to get some kind of deal to get these hostages home, as opposed to actually necessarily, as you said, fighting till victory. Mm-hmm. So how do you balance that? You're kind of pushing against what the majority of Israelis say they want.
The flip answer would be we elect people to make those hard decisions. You can't run a country on polls. Mm-hmm. I know that there are some elected leaders who do.
Yes.
I wouldn't recommend it because a poll is really just a snapshot of emotions. And if you know anything about polls, which I unfortunately do, they can say anything you want. Mm-hmm. So when you look at a poll, you have to understand first who was the one that had the poll organized and what were the questions. That's number one. Number two, we have to be very careful in terms of allowing popular sentiment to dictate the course of a war, especially in a country, a democracy, where the people constitute the army. It isn't the other way around. And as a result of that, emotions figure prominently in decision-makers' minds. There are some very difficult decisions that have to be made sometimes by our elected leaders, balancing the understandable needs of the few against the I would say, transcendent needs of the many. In a case like this where we have hostages, we cannot end this war allowing our enemies to succeed in using hostages to their advantage. It's difficult for me to talk about this because I know what it's like to be incarcerated. I know what it's like to be tortured. I know what it's like to be abandoned. Yeah. So my heart goes out to the families of the hostages and the hostages themselves. But unfortunately, hard decisions sometimes have to be made. And we have to admit that the way we end this war will set a precedence for the future. We cannot continue to endanger the lives of our people by allowing our enemies to weaponize our love for each other.
It's a very strong point that you made there. I do have to play devil's advocate, though, for a minute, because you said, with response to the ceasefire in Lebanon, that we can't put people in uniforms, we can't put people in danger zones and not fight to protect them. Each individual life is so important. And yet, on the other hand, the hostages are essentially soldiers fighting for us in Gaza or being trapped in Gaza. How do we not bring every one of them home? How do we reconcile between those two?
This is one of the hardest issues an elected leader can face. There was one MK who, during one of the Lebanon wars that we've waged, made the following statements. She said, if my son, who was a paratrooper at the time, were taken hostage, I would scream like crazy outside the Rosh HaMemshala's office to bring him home at whatever cost. But then I would go in to see the Rosh HaMemshala and tell him privately, do what is good in the eyes of the country.
Wow.
For the needs of the country, for our better, for our welfare as a country. I should tell you that I faced a situation where I was given a choice of being released in exchange for the release of numerous prisoners, with blood on their hands, security prisoners. And when Esther, my wife at the time, Alei Shalom, came to see me with this idea from the Prime Minister, she said, the decision is yours. Wow. You have no hope of getting out right now, so you're facing the rest of your life in prison. And before you make a decision, know that I will stay with you, whether you're in prison or you're in the midbar. I would not be allowed to come home, ever. So I thought about it, and I said, no, I won't go along with this, because I had to take into consideration the effect of releasing these people, these murderers, not just on the country, but on the victims' families. And I couldn't do it. There are many soldiers, Mayan, who have written letters to their parents or their wives saying that if they were taken hostage, that nothing should be done to secure their release that involves the release of prisoners or whatever.
Yeah, I've seen that.
This is something we have to keep in mind now. As I said, it's hard for me to talk to the families of hostages because I understand their pain and their longing to see their loved ones and the nightmares they have at night thinking about their conditions. But I will not be manipulated by the enemy, because that's what's happening. Right. They are weaponizing our love for one another, and we can't allow that to happen.
Jonathan, you are such a human person. I mean, you hear yourself talk right now, and it's beautiful. But you wrote something a few days ago that I actually want to read on. It was in you have this WhatsApp distribution group. I follow you very closely. I like to read your comments. And you said this: I have long believed that the greatest killer of our soldiers is the IDF. The tactics being employed in Lebanon involve a form of urban warfare that plays right into Hezbollah's hands. Instead of going house to house, which caused the death of these three brave Golani soldiers, it was a day that some soldiers had passed away, you said the army should simply destroy suspected enemy-held villages with artillery and burn them with napalm. So some might say this constitutes a war crime. I mean, you're talking about large-scale demolition of probably a lot of civilians. Elaborate. I mean, what's your actual vision here with regards to the enemy?
I could give you a quick answer by saying one's person's tactics, acceptable tactics, is another person's war crime. We have to remember where we are geographically. We have to remember who we're fighting. And we have to remember that what's called jus in bellum, the laws of war, are somewhat elastic.
Okay.
I'm not in favor of bombing a city that's full of civilians unless you've given those civilians fair warning to evacuate. The problem here is that we're fighting a determined enemy, a ruthless enemy that embeds itself within the civilian population. And just as I said before, we cannot allow our hostages to be weaponized against us, our love to be weaponized against us. We cannot allow our compassion for innocent or not civilians to prevent us from destroying the enemy.
So Hezbollah using the
correct. We have to remember that we value life as opposed to the enemy. And I particularly value our own lives. We cannot and must not engage in urban warfare. It's a kind of warfare that shows a reckless disregard for the lives of your own soldiers. This is why people like Sima Hassan, a wonderful person who heads the Mothers of the Fighters organization and who has children at war, has been trying desperately since the beginning of the war to get the army and the government to understand that it's better to use bombs than bodies to clear an area. I think the key thing is that when you give fair warning, it's already enough. It's the bare minimum.
Leave with the civilians then. I mean, if we send flyers and say, hey, we're going to come in, we're going to bomb this town, we're bomb this village, why would we be able to actually attack the enemy that way? Aren't they going out with the civilians at the same time?
They could. But that's why you have a system to check, to clear those leaving.
In other words, let them leave but check them on their way out.
Yeah, this happened, for example, in Fallujah in Iraq, where the U.S. Conducted a very interesting counter-insurgency war in an urban setting, and they, as opposed to Ramadi, which was a kind of a disaster, in Fallujah they actually filtered the people coming out and housed them, and then proceeded to destroy Fallujah block by block. There are many things you can do to filter out people, and the security services are very well experienced at doing that. So if I've been asked, well, what if the terrorists refuse to allow the population to leave? My answer to that, it's the fortunes of war. I am more concerned for the welfare of our soldiers than anything else. I was once asked by a group of Tanchanim, young guys and girls for that matter, who were going off to war for the first time, where does their loyalty lie? I thought about it, and I remember what my father told me. He said, you don't owe your loyalty to the flag or the country or the parliament or the president or your commanding officer. you owe your loyalty to the man or woman on either side of you. And I have that same loyalty towards the men and women who don our uniforms and put themselves in harm's way to defend us. I will not sacrifice their lives on the altar of some progressive, woke concept of how war should be won. As I said, Dr. Einat Wilf, I would recommend people to read her latest posting where she said how it dealt with how wars should end. And she said quite clearly and quite correctly, they end in either victory or defeat. And I would add to that a victory won with the least casualties to our side.
Yeah. So I want to jump, you mentioned the word woke, and that kind of brings me to the United States. So I'm going to jump over to the recent election. Donald Trump won. You supportive of that?
As opposed to what could have happened? Yes, absolutely.
Now, Trump has this idea of America first, and you've actually said that you want to kind of mirror that here in Israel with an Israel first concept. Yes. So tell me, what would that look like for us?
I think people have misunderstood what Donald Trump's America first actually involves. It isn't an isolationist policy like Charles Lindbergh had during the run-up to the Second World War in the United States. Trump's America First policy involves allied countries standing on their own 2 feet and shouldering the heavy weight, whether that means in terms of manufacturing their own military equipment or fighting their own wars. And if they do that and they pay their fair share, then Trump's America will be there by their side or at their back to help them. Now, what this translates out to in terms of an Israel first doctrine is as follows. The first thing we have to do is become militarily self-sufficient. And if anybody doubts the necessity of doing that, then they haven't been awake over the past year.
Yeah, with all of the weapons embargoes.
Correct. So we have to do that. And I would add, at whatever cost.
But can't we even physically manufacture all the weapons needed? Yeah, we can.
Yes, we can. I mean, that's a whole other show.
Well, we don't have to do that. I'm just curious.
The short answer to that is yes, we can. The second thing is we have to adopt a core doctrine, a new core doctrine of 6 principles. And they include the readoption of preventive and preemptive warfare against perceived threats. Second of all...
Just want to make sure that means take action before they attack us.
Correct.
Okay.
Second of all, the notion that we fight on enemy territory, not our own. Now, that's nothing new here. It's a policy that Ben-Gurion first started and that we've forgotten about. I mean, you can ask the people up north and the people down south about that. Thirdly, we have to drop the notion of proportionality. This is a very complex moral concept, but it's one that we have to understand is critical to our success in battle. Thirdly, or fourthly rather, we have to stop managing the enemy. We have to stop mowing the grass. We have to stop attempting to reach ceasefires. We have to pursue a policy of annihilation towards the enemy. They have to be utterly and decisively eliminated, down to the last.
When they're terrorist organizations.
Correct. Fifthly, and this is a difficult one also, we have to explicitly acknowledge our right to use nuclear weapons should we deem it appropriate and necessary. And lastly, and this also is controversial, we have to accept the doctrine of annexation, or the principle of annexation, that if you come to fight us, we're not only going to annihilate you by whatever means, but we're also going to take your land. This is something that most people understand in war. Yeah. You know, you lose your land or parts of it. And this is something, for example, in Gaza and in southern Lebanon that I firmly believe we should act upon.
I want to go back to the nuclear weapons. Iran is also on the cusp, let's call it, of developing a nuclear weapon. There's been a lot of back and forth in terms of what kind of attack we should carry out. Our last attack supposedly did excellent work in freeing the airspace to enable us to potentially carry out such an attack. What I've understood, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we might need nuclear weapons to attack their nuclear weapons in some capacity. Are you advocating for us going in and attacking Iran and eliminating their nuclear weapons, even if it potentially means using some of our nuclear arsenal?
Right. I think we first have to understand the nature of the threat. And put plainly, Iran represents the greatest existential threat to our survival since Nazi Germany. So let's just start off with an understanding of what the threat is. Second of all, I don't believe that the Iranians would be planning to actually use nuclear weapons against us initially. They would simply use them to cover more conventional threats like a Hezbollah rocket arsenal. And that if we get to the point where we're really beating Hezbollah, they would send a message to us. Which one of your cities do you want eliminated? If you don't want that, pull back. Okay, so we have to understand what the nature of this threat is. The Americans, I might say, the Biden administration and the Obama administration criminally misunderstood the nature and purpose of the Iranian nuclear arsenal. They actually feel, or felt, and still feel, that arsenal is being built to preserve the regime. It isn't. I mean, they've got bully boys on the street like the Basiji and the Revolutionary Guard Corps that can do a pretty good job of defending the regime. So in this current situation, people have asked me, well, are you in favor of an all-out preventive nuclear strike on Iran, with all that would mean in terms of civilian deaths? And I say in response, yes and no.
Okay.
The no is I'm not interested in city busting, because there is going to be a day after in Iran, and we have to allow them to reestablish some kind of sane government in that country.
Right.
However, I believe now the use of what's called an electromagnetic pulse weapon high up in the atmosphere would be an appropriate and effective use of nuclear weaponry. The EMP, or EMPs, if necessary, would basically put Iran into the Stone Age. Everything electronic is dead. And that means their nuclear weapons program is also dead. You need electricity to spin centrifuges.
Yes.
Right?
But you also need electricity.
If there's no electricity, the centrifuges are dead. I mean, they're not running. And many of them will be destroyed because they're unbalanced suddenly. So having basically shut down Iran, including their oil and gas industry, at that point we can unleash the Air Force for more pinpoint operations against their military-industrial complex and other targets, including their nuclear targets. Look, I was asked about Fordo, which is a nuclear weapons establishment, Iranian nuclear weapons establishment under a mountain. Right. And I was asked, we can't get at that. Well, they said the same thing about Nasrallah in Beirut.
True.
And we got to him. It's a type of operation using successive bombs, and finally, the final one can be a nuclear weapon if necessary. Mm-hmm. But there isn't any target I can conceive of in the world that can't be destroyed with a little bit of seichel, right? Yeah. So I've been misquoted from time to time in terms of wanting to take Iran off the map. I do, but not in a strange Lovian type of way. We have to understand, by the way, that Iran is not a homogeneous country. It's made up of several persecuted minorities, Azeris being foremost amongst them, and Arabs. And should Iran basically be put back into the Stone Age, you have to think about the day after. Well, the day after is the Azeris will probably seek unity, or I hate to use this term, Anschluss, with Azerbaijan, right, which would be fine for us. The Arabs who live in Khuzestan or Arabistan province, where most of the oil is, would be supported by the Sunni Gulf petrostates, Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia. And the oil and gas industry there, well, there is enough surplus oil and gas across the Gulf to provide China with a substitute for the oil and gas they're getting from Iran right now, except they'd have to pay market prices, which I don't think the Trump administration would mind all that much. So if you look at the day after, it would be a very different region where the Persians would have their core state, but under hopefully a more sane, representative, ethical type of government, and that the minorities would actually be able to live independently and not under the boot of a Persian overlord.
So, Jonathan, I want to get personal for a minute because we're going to run out of time, but I feel like people need to know you a little bit. So we're friends, as we said. You've lived a very controversial life, to be honest. You know, you're, as we said, a former agent of Israel in the United States. You were in jail. You survived that jail time. And eventually you actually came back here to Israel. What has life been like for you since coming back? You know, since your wife passed away, you've been remarried, many kids now. How have things changed for you?
There's an expression, I can't remember the Arabic, but it's honey and I can't remember the whole expression, okay, but it's basically some good things and some bad things. Coming back, I was very unhappy for a while, and Esther, alayha shalom, asked me, why am I unhappy? And I said, because the country I thought I sacrificed myself for doesn't seem to exist. Yeah, and she sat me down, as was her way of dealing with me, and said, you should understand that the land and people of Israel did not abandon you. The government did. Wow. And the government did to you exactly what they do to everybody else in this country. And I didn't understand that until October 7th. This whole concept of abandonment. Yeah. To lose my wife was the most earth-shattering experience I've ever had to suffer through. I mean, to hold your wife and count each breath until there are none is something you just never forget. But as much as she liberated me from prison as God's shaliach, she also liberated me from memory. Memory can be very constricting. And for me, I couldn't understand how I would ever get on with my life or love again after her passing, because it would feel like I'd betrayed her. Yeah. But she freed me from that guilt by ordering me. You know her, so she ordered me, she was emphatic, to marry a wonderful woman who was a friend of hers. I didn't realize she had 7 kids, but wonderful kids, wonderful kids. But Esther gave me life out of prison, and she gave me a future. And that's what I have now. My wife now is wonderful. I'm happy to be alive. I look forward to getting up in the morning and seeing her. It's funny in that respect. I was once asked to give advice to a young man who was going to be married, fiance, who was going to be married. And I thought about it, and I gave him the following advice. I said, never go to bed angry. Always kiss your wife good night and kiss your wife good morning, because you never know how the day will go. I woke up one morning and kissed my wife and buried her at night. But I said the most important thing to remember in life, especially married life, is your wife is always right. And I said if you follow that rule, your life will be a Gan Eden, which mine is now.
I think on that note, we should definitely end this podcast. Your wife is always right.
Correct.
Yes, 100%. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for
My
coming in
pleasure.
today and joining us.
Thank you, Mayan.
Yeah, thank you.